Welcome to the Storytelling That Sticks for Business and Life podcast. I'm your keynote, TED Talk and story coach, Doug Stevenson. In this podcast series, I'm going to share with you some simple and practical storytelling techniques and hacks that will make you stand out from the competition so that you can get paid to speak, or to give a TED Talk that goes viral, or to simply tell your story in a way that makes a difference in the world. You'll learn how to choose, craft, and deliver stories that stick. Personal stories from your amazing life, business stories, leadership and sales stories, stories that are marketable and memorable, stories that sell you and your product or service. My job as your virtual keynote and story coach is to help you design and deliver stories and speeches that get people to do what you want them to do, or to consider a new perspective. If you're serious about using storytelling to advance your career, to get paid to speak, or simply to get your message across in a more engaging and compelling manner, this podcast is for you. All right, well, let's get started. The journey to self-confidence and personal power often takes a big hit when you get in front of an audience to give a speech or tell a story or give a TED Talk, and you look out and see all of those faces staring back at you. Blank faces, curious faces, skeptical faces, bored faces. No matter how confident and secure you are in other areas of your life, public speaking can make you go weak in the knees, to make you doubt that the content and stories that you plan to talk about are as good as you thought they were back at the office, or when you were building your slide deck with all those bullet points and charts and graphs. So here you are, you're standing there all ready to go, and 3 minutes in, the faces staring back at you look bored. Or is it puzzled and confused, or distracted by what's on their phones? And in a millisecond, an absolute millisecond, you lose focus. You second guess yourself, but it's too late. It is too late. You're locked in. The slides are the slides, and there's nothing you can do now. It's too late. You're in front of the audience. So what do? Well, you plow on. But something's changed. All of that positive energy, that enthusiasm that you had leading up to the speech has evaporated. You have lost your mojo. Now, has anything that I just described ever happened to you? Have you ever given your power away because you were worried about what people staring back at you were thinking and feeling, whether they liked you or agreed with you or whatever? Or if the content you prepared was going to work with a particular audience? If so, you are not alone, because it's only natural to want people to like and approve of what you're saying. But here's the deal. There's nothing you can do to get people to like you when you're giving your speech. At the moment that you're giving your speech, there's nothing you can do about it. Your job as a speaker is to show up with enthusiasm and authenticity, and to deliver on the promise that you have something valuable to offer: solid content, great stories, stimulating ideas and concepts that will help them do their jobs better, to think differently or act differently in a way that improves their lives. Now, if you do that, if you provide them with something they can use, and your stories are smart, enjoyable, and entertaining, they may just end up liking you. In my experience, it's not about convincing them that you're good enough, smart enough, and have something valuable to offer. It's about convincing yourself of all those things. So here's the deal. Imagine that you're standing on one side of a river, and your audience is sitting in chairs on the other side of the river. They've gathered on the other side because they heard you were going to give a speech or presentation, and they're excited to hear what you have to say. So the river represents that space between you and your audience that separates you from them. It's the river of doubt that your speech is going to work, even though it's worked many times with other audiences. For some reason, with this audience, as you're looking out at them, you're just not sure. And the river of doubt seeps into your system. That's happened to me many, many times, especially when I've spoken in a foreign country overseas, Pfizer in Vienna, Red Bull in Amsterdam, the Ministry of Defense in Copenhagen, a tech company in Tokyo where I had a translator, Coca-Cola in Bogota, Colombia. Each and every time, right before I spoke, I felt that river of doubt in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't gigantic, it wasn't huge. And yet, I figured, you know what? They must have known what they were doing when they hired me. They knew what they were doing. So when it was time, I did what I was prepared to do. I gave the same speech and told the same stories that I'd tell anywhere else in the United States where I was most comfortable. So back to the river metaphor. Now, imagine that they're sitting there on the other side of the river and they have open minds. They're curious. Some are cheering you on and want you to succeed. Others are, well, let's just say they're neutral. And of course, others are skeptical because let's face it, some people are skeptical of everything all the time. But for the most part, they're waiting for you to stimulate them, convince them, tell them a great story, win them over to your point of view, to build a bridge for them to cross over. Now, the way that you build that bridge is by being so engaging, so crafty, so smart in your content, so good with your stories that they willingly come over to your side of the river. They cross the bridge to you. And in that way, you make a connection between you and them. In this episode, I want to talk about that invisible space, that space between you and your audience. Because when you're able to fill that space so that it's not even there, that's when you and your audience become one. And that's when the magic happens. You know, a long time ago, I used to get nervous before I spoke. I'd arrive all prepared to blow them away with my stories, full of confidence, knowing that I'd given this speech many times before and it always worked. And yet, when I'd look at the people gathered to hear me speak, I often felt like an outsider because they all knew each other. They were all part of the same organization and they were enjoying being with each other. I could see that they were happy. They were having a good time. They were chatting it up. But this nagging insecurity would creep into me right before I spoke, and I hated it. It was stupid. There was no factual basis for my insecurity, and yet there it was. So this one time, I was in Las Vegas, I think. Or was it Atlanta or San Diego? Well, somewhere for a speech. And the audience that day was an all-military audience. Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, and they were all in their dress uniforms. These were officers with medals and stuff on their shirts. And you know me, I was an actor in Hollywood. I was a realtor. No one in my family or anyone that I knew had any connection to the military. And there I was. There I was wondering what the hell I was doing in this room with these people. I was really intimidated by them. And I remember standing in the back of the room. Everyone had taken their seats and the program had begun with a few people speaking before me, you know. And I just felt like there was this huge gap between my life experience and theirs, like it was me on one side of the river and them on the other, me and them. And the space that I'm talking about is the and, me and them. There was no we in that room that I could tell. No sense within me that we were all in this room together for a shared purpose. In my mind, I was an outsider. I didn't fit. So I decided to try something different. And as I stood there in the back of the room, I started talking to myself. And here's what I said. This is us. It's not me and them, it's us. And then I began to focus on all the things we had in common. And I went down the list. I'm married. Many of them are married. I'm a father. Well, many of them are fathers and mothers. I'm a son. And I have a sister. Well, they're sons and daughters and have siblings too. I have a job. Well, they have a job. And I kept doing this for a good 5 minutes. This is us. This is us. There is no me and them. There is only us. We are the same. We are one. And for the first time in a long time, I stopped being nervous. And the speech went great. Oh my God, they loved it. And the comments that I got from people afterward proved to me that I was right. There was a lot of us going on in that room. They were a lot like me, and I was a lot like them. They just had different costumes. It was their costumes that freaked me out and my insecurity. In my book, The Story Theater Method for Strategic Storytelling in Business, I talk about becoming one with your audience, not trying to meet them where they are, but by inviting them to connect with you where you are, to cross over that bridge. In my opinion, a good speech or presentation, a good story, is an invitation for your listener to connect with you where you are, an invitation for them to cross that bridge to come into your space. Another way of saying it is that they come to you. You don't go to them. It took some time for me to realize that the only constant in every room that I spoke in was me. The audiences were all different and all the same. The rooms were all different and all the same. In every situation, I was at the front of the room and they were seated in front of me, watching, listening, and hoping that I was going to make sitting there worth their time. And sometimes it was easy because the audience in the room felt right. I think you know what I mean. But at other times, nothing felt right. The room didn't feel right. The audience didn't feel right. It didn't feel like a good match. And if I didn't have a way to stay connected to my power, I could easily have failed. So I want you to picture this. This one was really different, really unique. I was giving a speech in Peoria, Illinois, downstate from Chicago, to a large audience in a conference center, 2,500 people. And it was an after dinner speech. So the entire room was filled with people sitting at round dinner tables, 10 tops. That's 250 tables. And the tables stretched out so far into the distance that I couldn't even see half of them. No, check that, 3/4 of them. And on top of that, they turned the lights on the audience down so they were all in the dark. And the stage that I was on, this wasn't a platform, this was a stage, and it was 5 feet high, 1.5 meters high. It was 20 feet deep, almost 7 meters deep, and about 40 feet across, over 12 meters across. It was a massive stage. Can you picture it? And to make matters worse, the first row of tables was about 15 feet away from the front of the stage, 4.5 meters away. So I walked out on the stage after they introduced me, and it felt really weird. I was up high on this stage looking down at them way out there in the distance, and they were a long way away from me. And these bright lights were in my eyes, so it made it even harder for me to see anyone. And for a few seconds, I just stood there to get my bearings because it was really strange. And I looked out into the vastness of that room, and I said to myself, Douglas, this is us. This is us. We're the same. And then I began. And I did what I knew how to do, which was to tell my stories and deliver my content the same as if I was in a small meeting room in a hotel with 40 people somewhere. Because my only choice was to be me, to do what I do, and to not change anything because of the room or the environment or the audience. And I'm pleased to say that it worked. They enjoyed it. It was fine. And I learned something about myself. It doesn't matter who they are. I have to be me. The principle that I believe works, this is what I want you to know. The principle that I believe that works to close that space between you and your audience is to close the space between you and your power. I call it connect in to connect out. Connect in to yourself to connect out to them. Over time, I learned to connect in to myself, to my content and stories, to my unique personality and my quirky sense of humor, my deep desire to be of service to my audience, my compassion, to help them and to teach them and to be honest with them. And by connecting into myself and my content and my stories, I connected out all the way to the people sitting in the last row of tables in that convention center who could only see me by looking at the video screens hanging from the ceiling. By connecting in, I could be totally present for each audience to make sure my content and stories fit their needs, that the customization I had prepared would work. I want to change course for a second. When I was in London with Deborah for the first time, we were conducting story theater retreats in Hammersmith. And on our days off, when we headed out to see London, we had our first experience with the Tube, the underground trains. They call it the Tube. And down there by the trains are these signs that say, "Mind the gap." Now, the gap is that space between the platform and the train. It's a small distance. It's maybe 8 inches. But if you don't pay attention to the gap when you're boarding the train, your foot could slip down into it. It could be very dangerous. So you need to mind the gap. As a speaker, you need to mind the gap between you and your self-confidence, between you and your need to please or be liked, because the most dangerous gap, the most dangerous space is not between you and your audience. It's between you and your power, your uniqueness, your sparkling personality, your skill set, and your stories. Your value to your audience is that you are different. And by trying to fit in or to not make waves or to be controversial, you sacrifice your power. The most effective and congruent way to mind the gap, to close that space between you and your audience, is to close the space between your confident self and your insecure self. And when you do that, when you close that space, they will come to you. They will cross that river on the bridge that you have built, and you and your audience will become one. Connect in to connect out. Build a bridge of connection and invite them to come over. All right, well, that's it for this episode. If you feel that you learned something valuable today, something that you can use that will make your stories stick, stories that make you and your business memorable, marketable, and monetizable, there are 3 things I'd like you to do. First, click on the follow or subscribe button and leave a review wherever you listen. And second, share this podcast with your friends and coworkers, your email list, and on social media. And third, connect with me on LinkedIn. And when you're ready to get serious about taking your stories to the next level, or if you have an important speech, presentation, or TED Talk coming up, or if you want some guidance on how to make the transition to becoming a professional speaker, let's schedule your free 30-minute coaching session where we can get to know each other and see if we're a good fit. And as always, I'd love to hear from you with your questions and comments. Let me know that you're out there listening and learning. You can send an email with your questions, comments, and suggestions to Deborah@DougStevenson.com. That's Deborah, DEBORAH, @DougStevenson.com. Hey, thanks for listening. Until the next episode, I'm Doug Stevenson.